President Biden will be in California today to campaign for Governor Gavin Newsom as he faces a potential recall. Tomorrow is the last day to vote in that election. Millions of people have already cast their ballots in the race that has generated intrigue across the country. 46 candidates are looking to replace Newsom. The election carries implications for Democrats far past the nation's most populous state. Let's bring in Major Garrett to break this down for us. Major, this is the sixth time Republicans have tried to recall Gavin Newsom. Six times. What is different about this time?
Well, it qualified for the recall. And what did you need to do that? You needed 1.5 million signatures. Those in the Republican side who gathered those signatures got 2 million, so they more than qualified. But how did they do that? Well, it's interesting. Republicans objected to a lot of things that Governor Newsom was doing, but they particularly objected to what they regarded as overly restrictive measures to deal with the pandemic early on. They thought the lockdown measures were too severe. Well, one thing that they derived from those lockdown measures is they went to a judge and said, you know what, it's very hard to get signatures for a recall petition if you can't meet people face to face, which you couldn't under the lockdown restrictions. The judge said, you know, you're right. So we're going to give you an extra 4 months. What happened in that intervening 4-month period? Well, possibly the most famous, maybe infamous dinner in all of California political history occurred. Governor Newsom went to a place called French Laundry. It's a very expensive, some might call elite restaurant in Napa. He did so at the height of those lockdown restrictions. What did he do? He dined with lobbyists, up close, without wearing a mask. At the very time he was urging, as a matter of fact, finger-wagging at Californians, stay home, wear masks, don't go to restaurants under any circumstance. Well, lots of people regarded that, if not flagrant hypocrisy, certainly a grotesque contradiction of what he was telling the public to do. That sped up interest in signing the petition to bring a recall petition before the state, qualify it for the ballot, and that's why this sixth effort is different than the first 5. The first 5 failed. They had no real traction. This one got traction, at least in part, because of COVID.
Okay, so for people who don't live in California, haven't been following this all that closely, I want to just sort of break down how this process is going to work, Major. There are 2 questions that those who arrive are going to have to answer. Whether or not they want Gavin Newsom to remain as the governor. And then the next question is, well, who do you want to take his place? Can you talk to me a little bit about the slim percentage of voters that may have the power now to determine who will be the next governor? I know Gavin Newsom's sort of campaign, part of it has to do with, I think it's vote no and go, encouraging people not to even answer the second question, just vote no and then get out. So can you just explain it for the people in the rest of the country that don't try to recall their governors quite as frequently?
Exactly. So 22 million ballots have been sent out. They have 2 questions on them. Each ballot, same 2 questions. How do you vote on the recall, yes or no? To stay in office, Gavin Newsom needs a majority to vote no on recall. If he gets 49.8% on voting no on recall, he's out. He's got to get 50%. And if he does, then he stays in office. And it doesn't matter what the vote totals are on question 2. But let's say for the sake of argument, and the polls don't indicate this, but just for the sake of argument, Governor Newsom gets 49.8% on the no vote. Well, he's out. So then what do? You go to question 2 and you find out the top vote getter among the 46 candidates who qualified for this election. The current polling leader is Republican Larry Elder, who entered this race just in July, risen to the top largely with a Trumpian kind of Republican message here in California. Let's say he gets what he polls at currently, which is about 30 to 31 or 32%. With just that amount, 30, 31%, he would be the next governor of California, even though Gavin Newsom on the recall question, and again, for my sake of argument, got 49.8%. So you can almost win as governor and still lose your office and have a vote total, if you're the challenger on the second question, that's nowhere near as high and still become the governor of California. I know that strikes a lot of people as odd. This whole process was built in California in the early part of the 20th century, not by conservatives, but by progressives. What did they want to do? They wanted the recall ability to exist so voters could check the power of governors who they feared at the time would be too pliant or pliable to big interests in the state of California. Well, that whole process now is under review because lots of Democrats in California say this is no way to constantly harass a sitting governor with this recall petition process. It may be revisited if Governor Newsom survives this recall challenge.
And Major, we've been talking about the fact that some GOP members are already suggesting that if Governor Newsom survives this, it will be because the election was rigged. I know you spoke to Larry Elder, who is challenging Governor Newsom. Does he hold those sentiments?
He did for a few days, and he may still, but he didn't when he talked to me on camera. So a couple of days ago, he said, I think there's a shenanigans in this election. It may already be corrupted or flawed or in some way subject to fraud, and I've got a whole team of lawyers ready to challenge if Governor Newsom is declared the winner. When I asked him about that on camera, he said, you know what? Recall's going to win. Governor Newsom is going to be thrown out, and no one's going to dispute this if there are shenanigans at all. If there are shenanigans. Those are his words, not mine. And I said, wait a minute. Are you saying that you want people to vote? He goes, yes, I want people to vote. I want them to believe in this election. Possibly because he got blowback from two other Republicans who are also on the ballot. John Cox, who ran against Governor Newsom in 2018, lost handily, and the former two-term mayor of San Diego, Kevin Faulconer, both said, why is Larry Elder talking this way? There's no evidence whatsoever that the California ballot system is in any way flawed. This election is completely legit. And if he talks about it being flawed or in some way subject to fraud beforehand, he's going to suppress Republican turnout. Perhaps Larry Elder heard that. He did not say those kind of shenanigan things to me on camera. So we'll see where it lands. But I will tell you this, talking to lots of Republicans here in the state, the thinking based on internal Republican polling is no on recall is leading by 8 to 16 points. They think this race is effectively over, that Governor Newsom will hold on, and this whole fraud shenanigans thing isn't really going to be relevant because they expect Newsom's margin to be sufficiently high to prove the point and relatively early in the process.
Okay, so let's look at the chessboard that is the state of California. And Gavin Newsom, little piece on the chessboard, hoping to protect his position. Does he have to win by a large margin? If he sort of ekes through, does that have consequences as well?
I asked him that very question yesterday, and he said, look, a victory is a victory. Everyone in a tight race or even a semi-tight race likes to say that. But that's not the way Democrats are acting. President Biden would not be making 2 stops in California if, A, they thought this was in the bag and they weren't trying to run up the score. They're trying to do both things, make sure it's in the bag, victory is assured, and that they run up the score. Why? To discourage Republicans, both here in California and nationwide, to think that they have any real traction against the progressive/Biden agenda. All sorts of prominent Democrats have thrown in on this race in a very big way in the last 5 weeks. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar. They've all either donated, appeared, or cut ads, and former President Obama. Democrats want to run up the score here. They want to deter Republicans from believing that in a deeply blue state like California, where the registration advantage runs 2 to 1 in favor of Democrats over Republicans, that you can take out a sitting governor. They don't want that to happen. Also, they want to run up the score for another more practical reason in the midterm elections next year. They want to use Gavin Newsom, the governor's closing argument here, in those midterm elections. What is that closing argument? Simplified. That science-driven, those are Democratic words, restrictions or mandates for masks, mandates, or social distancing work politically and practically. And you portray Republican challengers as some kind of echo, either of Donald Trump directly or Trumpism in American Republican politics. That's been Gavin Newsom's closing argument. If he wins big here, lots of Democrats are likely to pay heed to that kind of strategy.
And so, Major, would the inverse be true then, that if Governor Newsom loses, that Democrats across the country, including perhaps even the President of the United States, would be thinking twice about any kind of restrictions or mandates with regards to the pandemic? In other words, Governor Newsom, if he survives this, will be able to say, look, when given the choice, people in California said, although these restrictions are, for some, not the way that they would like to proceed in their lives, people here in California think that, as you mentioned, Major, the science is with them. If Governor Newsom loses, then every Democrat in the country is going to be thinking twice about putting in mask mandates, about any kind of vaccine mandates that they might think, although the science backs them, the people don't.
Right. I grew up here in California, as you know, Vlad and Anne-Marie. I don't joke about earthquakes, but I will make a somewhat glib statement about this race if, in fact, Governor Newsom were to lose. It would be a political earthquake heard and felt all across the country. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all that President Biden from the White House last week leaned heavily in to vaccine mandates, seeing what was happening in California, essentially reinforcing the message, the policies, and the closing argument of Governor Newsom in California. Democrats have basically made this a defining line, not just for the pandemic, but for orientation toward government. And so President Biden is going to echo that here in California. He wouldn't, I'm sure he did that for scientific reasons, but you can't take politics out of it. And so we put that statement from the White House last week right alongside Governor Newsom here in California. They are aligned. And if they achieve a big victory here on the recall effort, they will say, you see, not only does this work in a scientific way, not only does it work in terms of public safety, but it works politically. And when you ask Californians, and all the polls reflect this, what do you like about Governor Newsom's approach? They generally are in favor, broadly here in California, Democrats, independents, and even some Republicans, of these coronavirus restrictions. And Governor Newsom yesterday in his press conference with lots of reporters there spent a lot of time reminding them that case rates are down, hospitalization rates are down, death rates are down at some of their lowest levels in recent months here in California. His argument, it's proof that these things work.
Recently, I've been seeing some articles pop up about Senator Dianne Feinstein, and that's also sort of a factor because whoever the governor is in California, should she decide to step aside, she's 88 right now, whoever the governor is will then pick a replacement, and that could upset the balance of the Senate.
Right, and Larry Elder had said somewhat recklessly that if he became governor through this recall process, he would try to get her out of office. I asked him directly about that. He said, Senator Feinstein's a senator. She's a senator until she decides to leave office or something happens to her. I would not deal with that at all. So he backed away from that. Trust me, Larry Elder has seen some of the damage done by some of his very firebrand, sort of Trumpian-like rhetoric, but in California that simply does not play well, and he has tried to move away from all of that. I asked him about a previous position he's taken as an intellectual economic argument that there should be no minimum wage. He said, that's not even an issue in California. I said, well, what do you believe? He said, it's not an issue. I don't want to talk about it. I said, what would Governor Larry Elder do about abortion? It's not relevant. Well, plenty of progressives in California say, look, that law in Texas is restricting access to abortion. Maybe someone like Larry Elder, who is staunchly pro-life and doesn't make a secret of it, would bring that to California. Larry Elder told me, I don't want to talk about abortion. I said, what about Donald Trump? Donald Trump is irrelevant in this election. I mean, you can see Larry Elder in the closing days trying to pull back on some of the things that he has said or written, either as a syndicated columnist or on his talk show, or just try to align himself with the Trump wing of the Republican Party, knowing that much of that just doesn't play well here in California. Like I said, internal Republican polls show recall 8 to 16 points ahead, meaning Governor Newsom's safe. And so Larry Elder will have to look at the next stage, probably, of his political career in California. And it's just as I was leaving his house yesterday in the Hollywood Hills, I said, is this your future? He said, I think it is. So I would say, even if Larry Elder doesn't win this race here in California and the recall effort doesn't succeed and Gavin Newsom stays in office, Larry Elder, who I said a moment ago just entered this race in July, rose to the very top, has raised almost $10 million very quickly, may well become a force in California, if not national politics, even if he doesn't prevail in this particular election.
I just wanted, Anne-Marie, just wanted to ask Major, when will we know tomorrow? How soon will we know? And, you know, we've mentioned the polls, Major. I'm sure Hillary Clinton supporters have a word. I mean, how when people are going to be thinking about polls, not just from what we saw back in 2016, I mean, but you've had folks like President Trump and others long suggesting that polls don't matter when it comes to elections of consequence. Right. So what do you make of that?
Sure, Democrats are still very nervous. They want to make sure that not only is Governor Newsom kept in office, but that he wins and wins big. And that's why there's all this emphasis. That's why there's the visibility of former President Obama. That's why President Biden is going to make not one, but 2 stops in California today. All of that being said, What is true here in California that wasn't true in 2016 or even in 2020 is that 5 weeks ago, there were a set of polls that showed the recall question very narrow, 4, 5, 6, 7 points. Republicans believed those polls and thought things were very close. Democrats believed those polls and really threw everything into this race. And now those polls have widened, and Republicans believe those polls. Larry Elder doesn't doubt those polls. So there is an acknowledgement on both sides that this race has been trending for the last 3 weeks, certainly in Governor Newsom's direction. To your basic question, will we know Tuesday night when polls close here, 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern? Probably not. It may be well into the evening. Even Governor Newsom's aides told me yesterday they're not sure if we'll know that night, maybe first thing in the morning Wednesday, but they expect to know relatively soon. And I asked Larry Elder, if the Associated Press or other news organizations call this race, will you agree with that? He said, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. So we'll have to tune in for that as well.
Yeah, definitely. Major, thank you so much.
Sure.